Sparta and Athens, a number of stereotypes almost immediately arise. Athens, liberal, cosmopolitan, free-thinking, intellectual, creative. Sparta, laconic, ordered, militaristic, grim, stern. Are those stereotypes have any basis in fact? Sort of, but there are a lot more to Sparta and Athens, that dichotomy, than we usually think. Hitler liked Sparta, of course. They were warlike, they were successful in battle, but so did Stalin, a communist. Not a fascist or a Nazi, a communist. And so did some of the kibbutzes in Israel. They were modeled, or at least in spirit, after the camaraderie and the collectivism of the Spartan state. So to understand what these two strange city-states were, we need to put them on a spectrum. Somewhere in the 8th century BC, 1,500 polises, we could call them city-states, arose. And they had all sorts of different cultures and governments. We know them as Corinth or Syracuse or Athens or Sparta or Argos or Mantinea. But we particularly focus on two of them. They're the two most powerful, and in some sense are the two most antithetical. Now, most Greek city-states had a constitutional system, a consensual system, that the property-owning class voted by majority vote for their officers. But something happened in Athens in 507 that was unusual. They allowed people who did not own property to participate in their new democracy. And over the course of its century, it became more radical, as the entitlement state tends to become. And whereas they paid people to go to the theater in the 5th century, by the 4th century they were paying people to vote. People were holding office by sortition, by lot. Equality, isonomia, was the foundation of the Athenian mind. We have that great speech of Pericles where he says, "We're not like Sparta. We believe in freedom, we believe in spontaneity, we believe in transparency, and we allow everybody to pursue their own dreams under the auspices of Athenian democracy." So they were atypical of the 1,500 city-states. If I could use an anachronistic word, they were more to the left. But to the right, there was something called extreme oligarchy, where only a few people participated in constitutional government. And that was true of Sparta. Whereas Athens had a democracy, was based on an assembly of free males, not females and not slaves, but free males, a very radical idea, without property. And they had an upper house, a boule, that presented business for the ecclesia to vote on. And Sparta was very different. It was the most free and unfree of all the city-states. They had a group, a damos, of 10,000 people. They were Spartan males who had been in the barracks together from age 7 all the way to 30. They dressed alike, they looked alike. They avoided ostentatious material things. They were taught to hunt, they were taught to fight. And within that body, they were equal. And just as Athens had done something very radical by extending the voting franchise to people who didn't have property, even earlier, Spartan had done something much more radical. When the city-states started to grow, they soon outstripped their food supplies. So the traditional response to too many people, not enough food, was to send out colonies. They sent out colonies to Italy, to the Black Sea, to Asia Minor, to Sicily, to Libya. But another response was to intensively farm. So they started to go up on the foothills of Greece, and they started to intensively terrace the land and irrigate and master the olive, the domesticated species of the olive, of wheat, of barley, of vines. But there was a third element, and only one city-state did it. Sparta decided to conquer their neighboring peoples and essentially enslave them, not as chattel slaves, but as serfs tied to the land. Now, Greeks might have slaves that were Greek-speaking. They had no racial connotation of superior or inferior. Anybody could be a slave by an accident of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, usually when the cities fell. But the Spartans had a unique idea, and they said, we can take Greek speakers collectively. In this case, the people who live around Sparta in Laconia, but more importantly, in the 7th through 5th century, the people of Messenia, over the great mountain of Taygetus. Around Mount Ithome, there was 200,000 Messenian Greeks and Sparta, through a 2-century process, conquered them. And that really warped their society, because it said that 10,000 equals under this barrack system that would all be equal would also be policemen. For every one Sparta, there was 20 or 30 what we call helots, those taken. That's what it means literally in Greek. And they would do one thing for the Spartan state. Whereas Athenians or Argives or Corinthians had to work themselves to produce their food, the helots would produce their food. If they produced their food, then Spartans could train for war, especially infantry, as heavily armed hoplites. The more serfs, the less work for the Spartans, and the more police duty. You can see the circular logic. We are policemen because we have all of these indentured servants. We have all these indentured servants, so they free us up to be policemen. Now, an artifact of that, an accident of that, is when the Persian Wars came along, who were the best fighters in Greece? It's the people who train from an early age to age 30 in the arts of war, because they have to make sure they have a secure food supply by monitoring the helots. But that system they created was very successful against people like Xerxes, as we saw at Thermopylae in the Battle of Plataea. So it was an accident that they became a great power when the intent was a sort of an internal Gestapo-type organization, if I could use that pejorative term. Within the Spartan state, it was pretty equal. So they solved the problem of equality in a very different way than Athenians did. They tried to expand the number who could participate. Sparta said, you can't do that. People are not equal. We're going to make people even more equal than the Athenians, because we're going to make them equal in the way they own property, equal in the possessions they own, the way they dress, the way they act, the way they speak. However, we can't do that with everybody. Just Spartans born to 2 parents. If you are born to a Spartan who married or coupled with somebody who wasn't a Spartan citizen, then you were something called a perioikoi, or a mothox, a bastard Spartan, or somebody who lived around Sparta. Or if you were a helot, you were not given the franchise. So Sparta solved the problem of equality in the way that South Africa did in the modern period, by hierarchy. South Africa was very democratic and very transparent for a small minority of white people, by saying everybody else is inferior. So when he asked, why did Stalin like Sparta, he said, because the elite were absolutely socialistic, communistic, as it were. And he didn't really worry about the other categories of oppression. Well, you can see these 2 systems were antithetical. Now, what's ironic about them is they were very successful. So of all the 1,500 city-states, by the beginning of the 5th century, the 2 most antithetical were the ones who had the greatest military power, in some ways the greatest hegemonies, and it didn't make any sense, because the philosophers said, and the political scientists said, and the casual observers said, is democracy more dynamic, or is extreme oligarchy? Or is Dorian severity or Ionic cosmopolitanism? Or is sea power more dynamic, or is infantry? Or being a land-based, inward, parochial society with heritage and conservatism, or being a sea-looking, outward-looking liberal society? And when these 2 societies finally, as allies, defeated the Persians, they soon had a period of alliance, and then they fell out, just like the United States and Russia did, because they were antithetical. And just as the United States and Russia were antithetical and powerful, remember now, we had these same debates in the 1960s, where people said the Soviets had this amazing 5-year plan. They beat us with Sputnik. This socialistic system, the communistic system, the collective system works better than the capitalist, free-going, unorganized, market-based democracies. So too with Athens and Sparta. They fell out, they had a rivalry, and from 431 to 404, 403, that rivalry broke it out into a series of war that collectively we call the Peloponnesian War. But then a funny thing happened. Athens lost. Now you can argue that Athens didn't lose to Sparta. Athens lost to Sparta, its ally Syracuse, its ally Thebes, its ally Corinth, and especially its ally Persia. But nonetheless, it lost. And that should have been the end of it, the verdict of cultures on the battlefield. Athenian liberality and its wonderful fleet and its overseas cosmopolitan empire, the city of Sophocles and Euripides and Aristophanes, was beaten by Spartan kings. And maybe their system, remember, it was equality for 10,000 of the select. They had two kings like Roman consuls. They had a damos, an assembly, sort of like the Athenians did, the ecclesia. They had a older group, the Roman Senate. They called it the Gerousia, upper house. They had an administrative class, an executive branch called the ephorets, and they had judges and judicial auditors. So it was a tripartite system. Maybe that was superior to Athens. But then an even funnier thing happened. Once they defeated Athens, and they tore down the walls of Athens, and they destroyed most of its fleet, and they overthrew the democracy. That should have been in this story, and it wasn't. For most of the early 4th century, Athens recovered. And the so-called Spartan hegemony then found a new enemy in Thebes. So much so that Sparta was defeated at the Battle of Leuctra in 371. In 362, at the Battle of Mantinea, it could not stop Thebes, and it ceased to exist as a power. The helots were freed by the great Theban liberator Epaminondas. There were great citadels built at Mantinea and Megalopolis and Messenia, and Sparta was hedged in, and it became a backwater. So this leaves us with this sort of perplexed argument that's been going on for 2,500 years. Does oligarchy work better than democracy? It's much more structured, it's much more stable, but it's also less imaginative, it's less free, and we get more people involved in the body politic, then it creates things like the Parthenon, or it creates an Isocrates, or it creates an Agora like we see at Athens. You look at Sparta, and what does it create? War poetry by Tortaeus, marriage ritual chanting by Alcman. You don't have the same degree of cultural infusion, so to speak. On the other hand, without the Spartan army, would have Athens been able to win the Battle of Plataea? Would they have stopped the Persians for 3 days at Thermopylae? No. So we're still in this quandary, and we have authoritarian regimes, even though Sparta was a class-ranked society, and even though it exploited the helots and the half-helots and the illegitimate Spartans, they look at that pure equality for the inner circle, and they like that communistic system that was holistic. We eat together in the barracks, we dress commonly, we don't like private property, we don't like ostentatious wealth, and they prefer that system. And we in the Western democracies say we're the natural inheritors of the Periclean legacy. And yes, they had exploited subject states in the Aegean, but they were a liberal democracy. One of the ways to resolve this tension and this ongoing debate that has no answer is nevertheless to look at Rome. Because when the Romans began to emerge as a serious power in Italy in the 5th and 4th century BC, and with the unification of Italy by the 2nd century BC, and with the extension of Roman power in the 2nd century BC to North Africa through the remains, the inherited remains of the Carthaginian Empire, and the expansion to Spain and Gaul, and then by the time of Augustus, an empire of 70 million subjects, 1 million square miles, they must have hit on something that neither Athens or Sparta could imagine, because after all, there was no law written in stone that the Athenians, who had imperial aspirations as far as Sicily and Libya, couldn't have been in early Rome. Why couldn't Sparta be in early Rome? But the Romans were very different, and they looked at both systems, and they sort of combined, and they pick and choose. From the Spartans, they liked the tripartite system of government. They did not like the idea in Athens that 51% of the people on any given day could kill Socrates, or line up Mytileneans on the island of Lesbos and kill them, or recklessly try to invade Sicily and then regret that they'd ever thought of the idea just 2 years later. That seemed that it was anarchy, that you were turning the reins of government over to the unwashed masses. So they looked at Sparta and they said, you know, among the 10,000 people, they had a pretty good tripartite system. We'll take the Gerousia and we'll translate it into the Senate, Latin term for the elderly, the men of property and stature who had established themselves. And we will have assemblies, popular assemblies like the Damos at Sparta, and we'll have consuls. And you know what? We'll have 2 of them so they will check each other, just like there were 2 Spartan kings. And we will have judges that will audit the laws, and we'll have a tribunalship that will make sure and keep people in the Senate and the popular assemblies honestly. And therefore, we will preclude the abuse of power. We'll call it republicanism, res publica. And this is so influential in the French Enlightenment with Montesquieu and the spirit of laws and our founding fathers. We today are an inheritor of the Roman republican system that's based in some part on the Spartan and even earlier Cretan system, not the Athenian system. We are not democracy. So we made that choice and we said representative or checks and balance or republican government is superior to radical democracies. At least we have so far. But that's not the end of the story. The Romans looked at the intrinsic weaknesses as well of Sparta, and there were many. If you take male children from the age of 7 and you put them in a barracks till 30 and they don't marry, you can see you have a problem with demography. And the Spartan state's biggest problem was it was always shrinking, and it did not have a commercial sector. And if somebody who was a helot or a mothox or a perioikoi, remember the perioikoi, was talented, they could not advance because people were put into particular hierarchies, not based necessarily on their talent, but accidents of birth. And they liked the Athenian system that said you can be a rower in a fleet and you can be as equal as a cavalryman. And so they liked the idea of mass participation. And so under republican government and a series of reforms, Rome took the Spartan brilliant model of checks and balances for a select few, and they said it's going to be for everybody. And that concept was very dynamic and soon even trumped the Athenian idea that democracy was for Athenians who spoke the Attic dialect and lived in Attica within a 100-mile or 50-mile radius of Athens. The Romans took that and said, you know what? You don't have to speak Latin necessarily as your original language. You don't even have to be Roman. You don't have to be Italian. All you have to do is accept the protocols of Roman citizenship, accept the divinity of the Roman emperor, the protocols of the Roman Empire, and you are a Roman citizen. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, millions of people who would never and would never go to Italy were citizens. And so they liked that Athenian idea, and they've evolved beyond it just like they did Sparta. And some of you are left, well, were they militaristic like the Spartans, or were they liberal and free thinking like the Athenians? And the answer, again, in typical Roman fashion, was they were both. The Roman army, they institutionalized an idea of civic militarism, where people would serve in the army under the Republic for 16 years. They had body armor, helmets with crests, not unlike the Spartans. They had a fierce visage. They encapsulated throughout society the virtues of militarism, of military training, of infantry dynamism. And yet, they took that system and they embedded it within Hellenic-based circle of intellectuals, the Scipionic circle. We immediately, when Rome comes on the scene, we have Ennius, and we have Livy, and then Persius, and Catullus, and Horace, and Virgil, of course, and Tacitus. So they had a Hellenic-based intellectual tradition under a free society at Rome that was stable politically and yet was able to be a force in arms in the same way Sparta was. So they squared the circle of taking two antithetical systems and combining them within one republican system. And today, we in America say sometimes we admire the Spartans and we like their attention to military affairs, and we have, in fact, the biggest military in the world today, larger than the next 26 militaries in terms of expenditures. And yet we have New York or Washington or intellectual circles, and that we subsidize the arts and we have sophisticated science in the manner of Athens. We say that, but of course, the United States and the Americans and most of Europe is Roman to the core. They have taken the best assets of both Sparta and Athens and combined them in the way Rome did, and the result is a stable and transparent society that is also quite capable of defending themselves in times of war.